Our next speaker will be Dr. Kate Houlden, who's a lecturer in the English department at Liverpool John Moores University. Kate's work focuses on issues of gender and sexuality in post-war Caribbean literature, and to complement the many articles, she has a monograph coming out called The Sex Life Gone Wild, Sex and Sexuality in the Post-War Anglophone Caribbean Novel. And that's due any time now? No, next year.
Early 2015.
Okay, early 2015 with Routledge.
Okay, so I want to start by talking very briefly about the wider project that this discussion comes from, and then I'm going to hazard into the territory of talking about V.S. Naipaul, which I may come to regret, but hey. So basically, this is part of a broader project where I'm writing about sex and sexuality in post-war Caribbean literature. Critical orthodoxy tends to have it that this literature is both sexist and homophobic. And there is some truth to a lot of these claims. But I'm interested in doing a number of things with this body of work. Alison talked earlier about moving on to looking at literature that wasn't necessarily anti-homophobic, but that was showing the kind of complexities and the difficulties of a heteronormative position. And I think some of the more interesting, kind of diverse, unexpected works I'm finding could be described as doing that. What I'm also interested in doing is taking on some of this combative, masculinist, nationalist voice that Denise has just talked about, and looking at the insecurities and anxieties of that voice and where they may be, where they can be situated or where they lie. So I deal with a range of authors, from canonical figures like Selvin or Lamming, through to lesser studied authors like Andrew Selke, Oscar Daythorne, Jan Carew or Rosa Guy. And there's a particular claim that I want to make overall, which is that it's the fictional rendering of sexuality where the contradictions of the nationalist project are most apparent. That in this literature, it's through the writing of sex where the tensions of the imagined unity of nationalism are most apparent to us. So sex both exceeds and threatens the unity of the political vision. I'd be hard pushed to find a more controversial author than Naipaul in a Caribbean context, and it would be fair to suggest that he is hardly known for his pioneering writing of sexual practices. But I want to suggest that even in Naipaul's work, we can find unexpected or unappreciated sexual currents. I also want to flag up that this is new work, so some of the kind of more theoretical positions that Denise and Alison have been talking about aren't yet threaded through. This is more kind of literary analysis while I'm thinking about the bigger picture. Okay, written mainly by men and critiqued for its marginalisation of women, post-war Caribbean literature has male experience at its heart. As David Scott has outlined, however, this is primarily the experience of a normalised middle-class nationalist modern male, whose faux universalism has served to exclude, assimilate or contain. Central to those excluded from nationalist models of citizenship have been men who desire other men. However, there are works by a number of authors from the post-war period, V.S. Naipaul, Jan Carew and Paul Marshall specifically, which combine both rejection of same-sex desire with more sympathetic renderings, providing an uneasy challenge to allegations of either silencing or hostility. Both Naipaul's 1971 work In a Free State and his 1975 novel Gorillas deal with same-sex desire, and Alison has also made a case that his later 1994 novel Away as the World has a character who can be read in queer terms. The former of these two earlier works, In a Free State, offers a stereotypical portrayal of homosexuality as Western contagion. Its queer English protagonist Bobby exoticizes Africans, taking a predatory stance towards the young men with whom he comes into contact as a government officer. And in this, there are certain parallels with Naipaul's notorious and very problematic description of E.M. Forster as having had his own purposes in India. He is a homosexual and he has had his time in India exploiting poor people. Although the difficulties Bobby faced as a gay man in England, including arrest and a subsequent nervous breakdown, are evoked with some sympathy, Naipaul nevertheless presents the character's failed sexual conquests as deriving from his fundamental misreading of the society he approaches as an outsider. On the surface, Gorillas offers an equally damning treatment of same-sex desire, albeit filtered this time through the viewpoint of the exoticized other rather than the white interloper. However, in drawing equivalence between the anal sexual rape of a woman and consensual male same-sex acts, Naipaul inadvertently reveals the lack of indigenous models with which to conceptualise alternative forms of sexual behaviour. Meanwhile, the eroticism infusing his protagonist's relationship with another man highlights the illicit desires haunting those assumptions of heterosexual male leadership on which the nationalist vision was grounded. And I kind of have struggled with this, but I do see this as a kind of inadvertent thing on Naipaul's part. If anyone's read the 2001 interview with Farouk Dundee, Naipaul is very explicit in his condemnation of homosexuality. So I find a real tension between what he ends up writing in Gorillas and what he claims to have set out, or what he claims his views are. Gorillas offers a bleak evocation of the post-independence Caribbean, showing a politically volatile and spiritually degraded society on the brink of collapse. Naipaul attacks both the delusions of post-colonial freedom and the platitudes of white liberal guilt through the novel's central trio of characters. Jimmy, a self-styled revolutionary leader of African and Chinese ancestry; Roach, a white, one-time anti-apartheid fighter, now working for a West Indian trading company of dubious origins; and Roach's mistress from England, Jane, a sexually jaded woman with little understanding of the complex situation she finds herself within in the Caribbean. Based on the true story of Michael X, Naipaul's Jimmy demonstrates starkly what the author sees as the failings of black nationalist ideology. Isolated in a rural commune with disaffected followers and little real power, Jimmy is having everybody on, and everybody is having him on. Everybody is pretending that something exists that doesn't. The author frames Jimmy's campaign as mere masculinist rhetoric, built on delusions of grandeur, and he also highlights his protagonist's complicity with those same colonial institutions of power he claims to reject. As Joan Diane makes clear, Jimmy is the exemplary fraud and mimic, the image of black power who wasn't even black, a husk stuffed full of ideas by liberal whites. Naipaul clearly presents sexual and political decay as going hand in hand, with Jimmy's political project frequently being articulated in terms of sexual reassertion. As Robert Hemingway puts it, this is a novel in which sexual relations illustrate political positions. Accordingly, Jimmy seeks to assuage the degradations of colonial status through his relationship with white Jane. From the first, we are told that her presence there was wrong and looked like an intrusion, with her sexualized demeanor being offered as the key evidence for her outsider status. Desperate for mastery over Jane, Jimmy enacts a grotesque parody of white colonial thought when he imagines her viewing him as a bronze god and wondering how he gets those black louts to respect him and behave with discipline. When they first have sex, the weight of these racialized fantasies overburdens the encounter. Fearing that he is losing the moment, Jimmy finds himself emasculated by Jane's casual indifference and metropolitan confidence. Barely tumescent and still wearing his shirt, he is described as looking absurdly like one of the children of the shanty towns, who wore vests alone, their exposed little penises like little spriggets. Foiled in his attempt to have specifically anal sex with her, Jimmy admits, I'm not good, you know," before, just like that, without convulsions, his little strange strength leaked out of him, and it was all over, and he raged inside. If Gayatri Gopinath is right, that Naipaul's earlier novel, A House for Mr. Biswas, was a melancholic vision of masculine failure, in which the author was unable to imagine a way of being at home outside patriarchal colonial logic, then here, Jimmy proves to be equally unaccommodated outside of black revolutionary rhetoric. Strikingly, in both this novel and Naipaul's factual piece, Argentina, the Brothels Behind the Graveyard, Naipaul focalises his critique of regional machismo through the motif of anal sex. Echoing Jimmy's first attempt to enter Jane, quote, where she was smaller, he frames Argentinian men as so diminished there remains only machismo, rooted in the conquest and humiliation of women. This conquest, Naipaul suggests, is complete only when he has buggered her. So diminished men turning to machismo diminish themselves further, replacing even sex by a parody. And anyone who's read the Philip French autobiography of Naipaul and his kind of interest in anal sex will find it entertaining that he dismisses it so readily as a parody here. Aside from the lack of evidence to support such claims, what is noticeable in this essay is the correspondence Naipaul draws between a diminished sense of masculinity and the desire to sodomize. Similarly, in Gorillas, Roach asks Jane, after finding out that she's betrayed him with Jimmy, "Did you pose for him with your legs open? Isn't that what they do with the women they've degraded? Or did he do the other thing, the other act of contempt?" So here, anal sex is kind of haunting the backdrop of Gorillas. The act finally takes place, and Jimmy's unspent rage is finally granted expression when he brutally anally rapes Jane before murdering her. During this horrific scene, Jimmy tells his victim it's going to be different today, words suggesting a reversal in the power dynamics of their previous encounter. Looking very big, the reader is told that he held her down and opened her up. When he entered, squatting on her, driving in, she began to wail. Words emphasising the actions involved rather than the feelings experienced, in keeping with Audre Lorde's definition of the pornographic as that which concerns the suppression of true feeling in favour of sensation. Suddenly, it is Jane who is infantilised, as Jimmy speaks to her as to a child, and she is frightened. Jimmy, meanwhile, withdraws, still erect and looking, quote, very big, before informing Jane that she's rotten meat. The phallic reassertion of men's power is self-evident here. More broadly, and in keeping with his claims in the essay on Argentina, Naipaul appears to be suggesting that the same rotten society of which Jane is a symptom has also created a breed of emasculated men, desperate to shore up their fragile sense of individual and political selfhood through fantasies of male dominance, enacted via specifically anal penetration. There are, however, tensions in Naipaul's critique of black nationalist masculinity, not least the fact that at times a certain authorial relish can be discerned in many of the descriptions of male violence and sexual assertion. As Carl Miller recognises, Jimmy's revulsion from Jane appears sometimes to be shared by the writer. More important, though, I want to suggest, is the figure of Bryant, one of Jimmy's followers, a fawning and ugly youth. Bryant is in an ill-defined homosexual relationship with his leader, about only minimal detail is shared. In contrast to the narrative primacy accorded to the interaction between Jimmy and Jane, Bryant's significance is only gradually revealed. Judith Ruth has discussed the shared structural relation between the middle, minor, and perverse, and the dominant, the normative, and the important, arguing that the concatenation of middle, minor, and perverse terms plays out as a moment in narrative where the possibility of a different perspective produces a threat to narrative and meaning. Such terms are directly applicable, I want to suggest, to Bryant. Although he is ultimately contained within the narrative through his dismissal in pejorative terms, he nevertheless unsettles the thematic unity of the novel, providing an implicit commentary on its wider action. Unsurprisingly, Jimmy appears the dominant figure over Bryant, and, on the surface at least, their interaction reinforces precisely those ideas of sodomy as assertion of masculine power that I've just outlined. Local politician Meredith Herbert, for example, describes how, in the case of Jimmy, there's a kind of dynamic about his condition that has to work itself out. Jimmy isn't going to end quietly in the bush, buggering a couple of slum boys. Irrespective of whether Bryant or Jane is the recipient, Jimmy's buggery of both is framed in terms of his diminished masculinity and his lust for power. If Jimmy can't revenge himself on a woman, it is applied, he will act out on a deformed young boy instead as compensation. Both Cecil Gutzmoor and Jackie Alexander have discussed the false binary between natural and unnatural sexual behaviours, which is frequently deployed across the Caribbean to police non-normative sexuality. And here, it is implied that Jimmy's influence draws both Bryant and Jane into an assumed spectrum of sexual deviancy, with some equivalence being inferred between the two. Equally, the novel's repeated emphasis on Bryant's youth provides evidence for Gutzmoor's observation that a foundational assumption of Caribbean homophobia is that homosexuality, especially in its male form, involves a strongly predatory paedophile tendency. And yet, This characterisation of Bryant as victim is not always borne out, and moments of real tenderness, far in excess of anything experienced between Jimmy and Jane, enter into Jimmy and the boy's relationship. Upset after watching the romantic comedy For the Love of Ivy, Bryant appears on Jimmy's porch seeking comfort. In watching the film, Bryant has seen the version of himself that no one, and that was the terrible part, would ever get to know. This alternative self, as Bryant conceives of it, is not dependent on a gun, a big profession, or big tour, but is instead simply a man worthy of being loved in and of himself. As Jimmy embraces Bryant, he recognises that his friend expressed all that he saw of himself in certain moods, while his description of the boy as lost echoes his own acknowledgement 30 pages earlier that he too is a lost man. Bryant, it appears, can vocalise those anxieties and insecurities of West Indian manhood lying beneath Jimmy's revolutionary quest. Later, when waking, restless and lonely, we are told that Jimmy put his hand on Bryant's shoulder and his fingers touched Bryant's neck. Bryant said, "Jimmy," and let the paper fall. Such beauty, if only it could be known. His hands moved down inside Bryant's jersey, felt the nipples twitch and harden, felt the well-defined chest, and then, moving lower, felt the firm moulding of Bryant's stomach. Bryant began to swallow. His stomach muscles tensed and dipped. Lower, past the navel to the hard curve, the springy hair, a man, after all, the concealed, complete beauty. But then, almost roughly, he withdrew his hands and went to the bedroom and the telephone. Jimmy leaves Bryant here so as to go and call Jane and arrange his first liaison with her. And in withdrawing his hands so roughly, the impression is given, perhaps, of a choice having been made between the two. Jimmy, it appears, must affirm a heterosexual identity, or at one and the same deny a queer one, in order to preserve his identification with the black nationalist community. At the level of language, however, the novel appears to place greater value on homoerotic and homosexual exchange, with this writing of Jimmy and Bryant's relationship, according to Audre Lorde's description of the erotic, as not only what we do, but also as how acutely and fully we can feel in the doing. The possessiveness with which Jimmy claims Bryant's body here stands in contrast to the subsequent sexual encounter with Jane, where he is aware of her breasts only as flesh and observes her genitals, describing them as the cleft was like a dumb, stupid mouth. Following sex with Jane, Jimmy's thoughts immediately turn elsewhere. He longed for the feel of Bryant, for Bryant's warm, firm flesh and his relieving mouth and tongue. Later, he feels that his room has been violated by Jane's presence, and he notes the stained bed where he was still unwilling to go. The seeming equivalence drawn between Jane and Bryant as victims of Jimmy's sodomizing urges is undermined by this preferentiality, with Lillian Feder proving one of the few critics to recognise that Jimmy's deepest erotic attraction is in fact to the boy. As a result, Jimmy's evocative words that I've underlined here, "if only it could be known," can be interpreted as gesturing towards those sexual desires incompatible with the bravura masculinity of black revolutionary rhetoric. If Naipaul intended to write a straightforward critique of black revolutionary leadership through exposing Jimmy's phallic domination of his subordinates, then something appears to have gone awry in its execution. Although Guerrillas seemingly revolves around the quest for and suppression of the white woman, Jane, it is in fact Bryant who takes centre stage at its close, with Jimmy giving him permission to strike the fatal blows, saying, "Kill the rat." In so doing, Jimmy effectively chooses Bryant over Jane, a decision he justifies to himself with the rationale that such an act will ameliorate Bryant's deteriorating mental condition. Such preferentiality also raises questions, I suggest, about the accusation of sexism levied against this and a number of other books at the time, for in common with many homosexual novels of the earlier 20th century, Naipaul could perhaps be seen to be employing a female figure as a foil to legitimate the desires of his male protagonist. The novel's apparent censure of homosexual acts is undercut by the poverty of the heterosexual relationship against which it's compared. Although in his writings Jimmy himself may dismiss Bryant as a slum boy, words directly echoing those of politician Meredith Herbert, he also in the same passage describes the youth as someone I love. I gave him so much love. Jimmy's repetition of Meredith's words, slum boy, can in itself be seen as expressive of the lack of Indigenous models with which to conceptualise his bond with Bryant. As such, Jimmy's thwarted and emphatically unnamed desire provides an early articulation of the difficulties of homosexual love in the Caribbean. This inability to name non-normative sexual desire is given further significance by the parallels between Jimmy and local politician Meredith, whose words Jimmy has just recycled. A successful solicitor and radio personality, this one-time minister's character is just as much of a, quote, creation as Jimmy's. It is underlaid by a similar hysteria, rages, deprivations, and unappeased ambition, and he has an equally mesmerising effect on Jane. Recalled to government by the new regime, Meredith convinces himself that he has the common touch and can speak for the poor black majority, despite the fact that actually they don't want to hear anyone like Meredith. Brought down by his own ambition, Meredith is attacked and publicly humiliated by the very masses for whom he claims to speak, with the reader being told that a child could have told him that they were calling him back to government just to throw him to the crowd. Just like Jimmy, Meredith's dreams of individual assertion have been manipulated by those holding real power on the island, and the novel ultimately concludes, events move too fast for him, Jimmy, and for Meredith too. The two of them wanted to play Bad John, and the two of them get licked down. Both men appear symptomatic of a wider Caribbean malaise rooted in masculine deficiency, with Martin Kitch highlighting how both Jimmy and Meredith seek to dispel private inadequacies in public political successes. Whether such men choose the path of guerrilla or government minister, Naipaul appears to be suggesting, is immaterial. Consequently, Jimmy's relationship with Bryant serves to highlight the illicit desires haunting not only black revolutionary claims, but also the nationalist project itself. At the same time, novels such as this raise questions about canonicity. The very fact that sex has been tended to be seen outside of boom period concerns about race or nation building, for example, is perhaps the reason why its exploration reveals so much that is unexpected or contradictory on these same issues. As a result, these works can usefully be framed against Heather Love's discussion of the losses of queer history. Although she addresses writing primarily from the modernist era, Love underlines the hazards of canon formation more generally, pointing to how feeling bad has been a crucial element of modern queer experience that has not been adequately addressed in histories of queer representation. She also cautions, the challenge is to engage with the past without being destroyed by it. Sometimes it seems it would be better to move on, to let, as Marx wrote, the dead bury the dead. But it is the damaging aspects of the past that tend to stay with us, and the desire to forget may itself be a symptom of haunting. The dead can bury the dead all day long and still not be done. I'm kind of curious how this ties with your point of creolisation needing to go back to the moment of discovery. How much does queer history need to go back to the negations of queer history itself? Just as I position homosexual desire as haunting nationalist representation of the era, so too these novels trouble the way in which literary critical discourse has established a narrative about the treatment of sexuality in post-war writing. The consensus about its alleged negation of same-sex desire can perhaps tell us more about the need to establish distinct claims for contemporary fiction and about the nationalist lens through which the post-war period has tended to be interpreted than it does the actual realities of much writing from that era.